May 12, 1943, near Cap Bon, Tunisia. The desert wind howled across the dunes as the last of the Afrika Korps laid down their weapons. The once proud soldiers of Rommel's army veterans of Tobruk el Alamein and Kasserine Pass now stood in silence, their boots sinking into hot sand hands, raised eyes dulled by exhaustion and disbelief. For months they had fought the British Eighth Army under Montgomery, and the Americans under Patton holding out against impossible odds. But now surrounded on all sides, the Desert Fox's men faced the inevitable. Over 230,000 German and Italian troops surrendered that day, the largest capitulation of Axis forces since Stalingrad. Sergeant Karl Brenner, a 26-year-old tank mechanic from Bremen, stared at the endless line of captured soldiers stretching toward the horizon. His uniform was caked with dust, his field cap missing. He whispered to the man beside him, "So this is it. The end of the war for us." His comrade Private Otto Weiss gave a grim smile. "No, Karl, the end of freedom." The Allied guards herded them into columns, their Lee-Enfields glinting in the sun. Trucks rumbled past American GMCs and British Bedfords loaded with crate supplies and men. The prisoners expected rough treatment. For years, Nazi propaganda had told them the British were cruel and the Americans savages who tortured prisoners and forced them into slavery. When the first truck stopped, a British officer, his khaki uniform immaculate, despite the heat shouted through a megaphone form ranks, "You'll be given water and rations shortly. Anyone causing trouble will answer to me." The men froze. Water rations. They had expected whips, not bread. That evening, as the desert cooled, they were marched toward the coast. On the horizon, ships waited in silence, grey silhouettes against the fading sun. Karl watched the ocean for the first time in months, his throat dry, his stomach hollow. Nearby, an American guard tossed him something small. Karl caught it, a cigarette Lucky Strike. The soldier grinned. "Smoke up, pal. You're done fighting." Karl hesitated, then lit it. The first puff burned his throat, harsh, foreign, and strangely kind. He looked at the flame and wondered, could the enemy really be this human? That night the convoy rolled toward the ports of Bizerte and Tunis. The captured men whispered among themselves, some fearful, some relieved. None of them knew that their next destination would not be the forced labour camps of nightmare propaganda, but something entirely different, a journey across oceans into the heart of their enemy's homeland. As the sea wind carried the scent of salt and diesel, Karl murmured, "If they don't kill us, maybe they'll use us." Weiss nodded. "They'll make us slaves. You'll see." They had no idea how wrong they were. June 3rd, 1943, aboard the SS, John Ericsson, Mid-Atlantic. Rain lashed against the steel hull as the convoy ploughed through grey water. The sea stretched endless and cold, its surface broken only by whitecaps and the silhouettes of distant escort destroyers, vigilant shapes against the storm. Beneath deck, hundreds of German Pistols huddled in tight rows, the air thick with diesel salt and damp wool. Sergeant Karl Brenner sat on a wooden bunk, his back pressed against the bulkhead. Every few seconds the ship creaked with a swell, and water dripped through the seams above. Around him men muttered in low voices, some praying, some whispering rumours. "They're taking us to Canada," one man said. "No to America," another corrected. "They'll make us dig coal until we die." Someone laughed bitterly. Better than starving in Russia. A Marine guard walked past, the Rose rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes alert, but not hostile. Occasionally he offered the prisoners tin cups of coffee or passed around cigarettes. The Germans stared at him in disbelief, this casual, unafraid young man who treated them as if they were simply passengers on a long voyage rather than defeated enemies. At dusk, the prisoners were allowed on deck in small groups for air. The sea wind cut sharp and cold, but the open sky was a relief after the stifling hold below. Karl leaned on the railing, watching the faint outlines of other troopships in the convoy. He noticed an American sailor nearby lighting a cigarette, his rain poncho flapping in the wind. The sailor offered him one without a word. Karl accepted. Their lighters met in a brief flash of orange, illuminating faces that could have been brothers, both tired, both young, both far from home. The sailor finally spoke, voice muffled by the wind. "You fought under Rommel?" Karl nodded. "Heard he was a damn good general." Karl hesitated. "He was fair." The sailor grinned faintly. "Then maybe you'll like it where you're going." Karl didn't understand what that meant, not yet. But the tone was oddly sincere. Days later, as the ship neared Halifax, the prisoners were issued new uniforms, plain khaki with POWs stenciled on the back and fed thick stew with bread and butter. It was more food than many had seen in months. When the convoy finally reached port, guards formed ranks and called roll. The prisoners expected barbed wire dogs and guns. Instead, they saw clean barracks laundry lines and men playing baseball behind fences that looked more symbolic than menacing. Carl muttered almost to himself, "This can't be right." Nearby, a British officer looked over the men and said calmly, "Welcome to your new camp, gentlemen. You are now under the protection of the Geneva Convention." That night, as rain tapped softly on the tin roof, Carl lay awake on a real mattress. The room smelled of soap and coffee. Outside, the floodlights hummed quietly. For the first time since North Africa, he felt safe, and that confused him more than fear ever had. July 1943, Camp Atterbury, Indiana, United States. The first thing Carl Brenner noticed was the smell. Not of decay or fear, but of freshly cut grass and baked bread. After weeks at sea and days on a train that thundered through endless green fields, the German POWs finally arrived at their destination, a place so far from the warfront that it felt unreal. Camp Atterbury lay just south of Indianapolis, surrounded by white oak and cornfields that shimmered under the summer sun. Barbed wire fenced its perimeter, but inside life felt strangely normal. Barracks were clean, the showers worked. There was a mess hall with trays, tables, even coffee mugs. As the prisoners marched in under the watch of American guards, many braced for humiliation, jeers, slaps, starvation. Instead, they were greeted by a sergeant with a clipboard, who said in a calm, almost bureaucratic tone, "You'll be assigned bunks, medical checks, and work details. Follow the rules, and you'll be treated fair." That word fair echoed through the ranks. It didn't fit their idea of captivity. Carl watched as one guard pointed toward a building flying both the stars and stripes and a smaller Red Cross flag. "Sick or wounded. Report there. No one works sick." That night, dinner was served beef stew, mashed potatoes, peas, bread, and coffee. When the Americans saw the prisoners hesitate, one guard laughed softly. "Eat. It's not poisoned. You guys lost, not starved." The men exchanged glances, half in disbelief, half in embarrassment. Otto Weiss took the first bite, then another. His eyes widened. "Carl," he whispered, "this tastes like home." In the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., a bugle call sounded. Prisoners lined up for roll call, then went off to assigned work, mostly farm labour logging or repairing roads. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work, provided it wasn't in direct support of war production, and the Americans followed it meticulously. Farmers from nearby towns arrived in trucks looking for help with harvests. "You boys ever milk cows?" one farmer asked, trying to make conversation as the guards translated. Carl shrugged. "We fix tanks, not cows." The farmer laughed. "Well, a cow's less likely to shoot back." Soon the German POWs became part of Indiana's agricultural life. They picked corn-built fences and stacked hay, and every week they were paid not in dollars, but in coupons, small tokens, redeemable at the camp canteen for cigarettes, chocolate, or postcards home. Carl couldn't believe it the first time he was handed a pack of Lucky Strikes in exchange for labour. "They're paying us to work," he murmured. "Yes," the interpreter said simply. "Cigarettes, bread, and trust, it's more than some get these days." Evenings were quiet. The camp library had books, even some in German. There were music nights, soccer matches, and English classes for those who wanted them. American guards often stood watching, not as overlords, but like curious hosts observing strange guests. It was in these small gestures, a shared smoke, a fair wage, a loaf of warm bread, that the impossible began respect, replacing resentment. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Indiana fields, Carl sat outside the barracks writing a letter he wasn't sure would reach Bremen. "Dear Mother, I am a prisoner, but I am not treated as one. The Americans feed us, pay us, even smile at us. It is confusing, Mama, to be shown kindness by those we were told were monsters. Perhaps everything we believed is not as true as we thought." He paused, staring at the golden sky. Somewhere beyond the fence, an American boy's laughter echoed from the farmhouse across the road. Carl whispered almost to himself. Maybe this war won't end in hatred after all. Autumn 1943, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. By October, the Indiana air had turned crisp, carrying the smell of corn husks and wood smoke. The maple trees outside the wire burned with red and gold, and for the first time since his capture, Sergeant Karl Brenner felt something close to peace. He had grown used to the strange rhythm of captivity, the whistle at dawn, the trucks that carried work crews to nearby farms, the soft murmur of English that no longer sounded like the enemy's tongue. Life inside the camp had become a quiet routine of labour conversation and small kindnesses that still puzzled the men who had once called themselves the master race. That morning, Karl and a dozen others loaded onto a flatbed truck headed for a dairy farm in Bartholomew County. The driver, a local man named Harold Whitmore, tipped his hat as they climbed aboard. "Mornin', boys. Hope you like cows better than tanks," he joked. The men laughed genuinely this time. Humour was safer than pride now. When they reached the farm, Karl was handed a shovel. Harold's teenage son Danny watched from a distance wide-eyed at the sight of real German soldiers standing in his family's barnyard. He whispered, "Pa, they don't look mean." Harold replied quietly, "They're just men who lost." By midday, sweat glistened on Karl's brow as he shoveled feed into troughs. A dog padded up beside him, wagging its tail. Instinctively, Karl reached down, scratching behind its ears. The boy Danny smiled. "He likes you." Karl, searching for the right word, said in halting English, "Good. Dog. Good boy." The boy nodded eagerly. "You're not what I thought." Karl tilted his head. "And what did you think, that Germans were evil?" Karl's hand paused on the shovel. He didn't answer right away. Finally he said softly, "Many are not. War makes both." That evening, when the men were driven back to camp, Harold handed each a loaf of bread and a few apples from his orchard. "For the ride," he said, waving off their hesitant gratitude. "You worked hard." Otto Weiss stared at the bread in his hands as if it were gold. "They treat us better than we treated our own labourers," he muttered. Karl nodded. Maybe that's the point. Over the next months, letters from home began to trickle in. Most were censored and delayed, but they painted a grim picture: cities in ruins, ration cards, nearly worthless families surviving on turnips and hope. The contrast was unbearable. Here in enemy hands, they had food, shelter, even cigarettes. At home, their families starved under the bombs of the Reich's own hubris. One night in the barracks, as the men listened to the faint hum of a distant American radio, Otto spoke up. "When this war ends, what happens to us?" Karl stared at the ceiling, watching shadows shift. "We go home. We rebuild. Maybe we remember this. Remember what that mercy can be stronger than hate." Outside, snow began to fall, the first flakes of an American winter. The guards patrolled quietly, breath steaming in the cold. A few of them stopped by the fence, offering matches to prisoners lighting evening cigarettes. Through the fence, Karl exchanged one final glance with a young guard who reminded him of his own brother. They didn't speak the same language, but in that frozen silence something passed between them. Something no order, no propaganda, no Führer could command. It was the realization that dignity had survived the war, even where victory and defeat had blurred into the same weary grey. May 1944, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The Indiana spring came alive again, lilacs blooming along the fence line, the distant clatter of tractors echoing through the fields. To the German POWs, it was the sound of another world still turning, while theirs lay in ruins. By now Karl Brenner had become foreman of a small work crew that built wooden crates for local farms. The Americans trusted him enough to hand him tools without counting them afterward, something that still astonished him. The men no longer worked under guard with rifles pointed at their backs. They worked under watchful but casual supervision, more like hired labourers than captives. At the camp canteen, Karl exchanged his weekly pay coupons for bread-canned peaches and 2 precious packs of Lucky Strikes. Cigarettes had become a kind of currency and a quiet symbol of respect. The guards often smoked alongside them, leaning against the fence as if they were all just waiting out the same long war. One afternoon, as Karl rested under an oak tree, an American corporal named Frank Danner offered him a smoke. The two men had grown used to short conversations, fragments of broken English, and gestures that made sense despite the gaps. Frank struck a match and said, "You got a family back home?" Karl nodded. "Mother? Bremen? Maybe house gone?" Frank looked at the horizon. "My brother's in Europe now. Don't know where. Maybe fighting your army." There was a pause, not awkward but heavy. The wind rustled the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and soil. Karl finally said, "War makes enemies. Peace makes men." Frank exhaled slowly. "Guess we'll find out which one we are." That night, a radio report swept through the camp Rome had fallen to the Allies. The Germans gathered around a small receiver, listening in silence. No one cheered, no one spoke. But the weight of inevitability pressed harder than ever. Later, during evening roll call, an American lieutenant announced work details are expanding. Volunteers needed for harvest aid in the nearby counties. Same pay cigarettes, bread and bonus coupons. Hands went up immediately, not out of duty but out of the strange gratitude that came from being trusted. Carl's group was assigned to a farm near Columbus, Indiana. The farmer's wife, Mrs. Whitmore, the same family they'd helped the previous autumn, greeted them with apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Her husband joked, "Looks like my wife bakes better for Germans than for me." They all laughed. For months the work continued. Children from nearby towns began to wave as trucks full of enemy soldiers passed by. On Sundays, locals sometimes brought the POWs lemonade or fresh bread. What had begun as suspicion had turned into a quiet understanding, a small local peace treaty of human decency. By August, some prisoners had even formed a choir, their voices drifting beyond the fences in hymns that mixed homesickness with strange serenity. Townsfolk would sometimes stop along the road to listen. And then came the day that changed everything. Late in summer, word spread that D-Day had begun. Normandy. Thousands of men, perhaps even Frank's brother, stormed beaches far across the ocean. The German prisoners gathered near the barracks, listening to the wireless as news crackled in from Europe. No one shouted, no one cursed. Carl simply stood still, hands in his pockets, staring at the flagpole where the American flag swayed in the hot wind. Weiss whispered, "It's ending, isn't it?" Carl nodded. For us, maybe it already did. Weeks later, Frank approached him at the canteen. "He made it," he said, quietly. "My brother wrote me from Normandy. He's alive." Carl smiled faintly. "Gut. That is good." Frank handed him something, a small tin box with a hand-carved lid. "Take it. You built those crates for my uncle's farm. He said it was the best work he ever got. Said to thank you." Inside was a single fresh loaf of bread and a note, from one worker to another. Not enemy, just man. Carl stared at it for a long time. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That night, as rain fell softly on the tin roofs of the barracks, he tore the loaf in half and shared it with Otto. They sat in silence, the taste of warm bread mixing with the faint smoke of their last shared cigarette. "Cigarettes and bread," Otto said quietly. "That's how they fight their wars." Carl shook his head. "No, that's how they end them." May 1945, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The loudspeakers crackled one morning just after sunrise. A voice came over the line, calm but firm. "Attention all personnel, Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." The words hung in the air like a ghost. Some prisoners froze mid-step, others simply stared at the ground. For years they had dreamed of this announcement, and now that it had come, none of them knew what to feel. Inside the barracks, a group of men gathered around the radio as swing music drifted faintly from American stations. For the guards, it was victory. For the German POWs, it was something more complicated, the death of everything they had once believed in. Sergeant Karl Brenner sat on his bunk holding a small photograph of his mother. The corners were frayed, the image faded. He whispered in German, "So it's done." Otto Weiss, sitting nearby, muttered, "We lost the war long ago. Today we just learned to admit it. The camp changed overnight. Tension evaporated. Barbed wire seemed less threatening, the guards less formal. The prisoners still worked, tending fields, mending roads, but now they did it with the strange lightness of men whose fates had been returned to them." At the canteen, Carl noticed something unusual. Instead of their usual pay and coupons, the quartermaster handed each man a small paper envelope. Inside were American bills, $5 each. "End-of-war bonus," the clerk said with a grin. "Buy something for the trip home." The men didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The same hands that had once carried rifles now offered them money. Real money, to take home from captivity. Soon after, the trucks arrived. The prisoners were to be sent east to processing centres in New Jersey before repatriation to Europe. Farewells were awkward but heartfelt. Guards shook hands with men they had once watched down the barrel of a gun. Frank Danner found Carl near the gate. "Guess this is it," he said, offering one last cigarette. Carl accepted it. "Yes. Maybe one day we see each other again, not like this," Frank smiled. "Maybe. I'll buy you a drink instead of guarding you." They shared a quiet laugh. Then Carl looked at the horizon, the same American farmland that had once been his cage, now strangely hard to leave behind. The convoy rolled out under a sky streaked with soft morning light. Townspeople gathered along the road, waving politely as the trucks passed. Children shouted goodbye in broken German taught by their parents. For all the bitterness the war had brought, this was not how the Germans had imagined it would end, not in chains, not in hatred, but in something gentler, something that felt almost like forgiveness. When they reached the port in New Jersey, they saw ships bearing the Red Cross flag waiting to take them home. The men boarded in silence, carrying small duffel bags filled with gifts, bread, chocolate, cigarettes, letters, and even postcards from American families. As the ship pulled away, Carl stood at the railing watching the Statue of Liberty fade into the fog. Beside him, Otto whispered, "Do you think they'll hate us when we get home?" Carl exhaled smoke into the grey wind. Maybe, but they didn't. That will matter someday. Months later, in a shattered Bremen, Carl walked through ruins that smelled of smoke and salt. His mother's house was gone, but in his coat pocket were two things he had kept from the camp, a Lucky Strike cigarette and a folded note that read, "To the man who fixed our fence, remember decency outlasts war." He looked up at the sky where crows circled above the broken city. He lit the cigarette slowly, the familiar crackle breaking the silence. For the first time in years, he did not feel like an enemy, just a man who had survived long enough to learn that even in war, humanity can be rationed, but never destroyed. Lessons from an unexpected kindness. Humanity behind the barbed wire, in the long shadow of World War II, few moments revealed the endurance of human decency more clearly than the treatment of German prisoners of war in Allied camps. These were men who expected chains and cruelty, yet found instead fair wages, cigarettes, bread, and dignity. What happened behind the fences of places like Camp Atterbury or Camp Shelby was more than an act of compliance with the Geneva Convention. It was a quiet moral victory that transcended the battlefield. The American guards who shared their rations, the farmers who shook hands with former enemies, and the prisoners who learned to say thank you in English all participated in something profoundly human, the recognition that respect is stronger than revenge. Every cigarette traded and every loaf of bread shared was a seed of reconciliation planted years before peace was officially declared. From that history, we inherit lessons that reach far beyond war. Kindness extended to those who least deserve it can change the course of the future. Justice without cruelty builds longer bridges than vengeance ever could. And empathy offered, when the world expects hatred, reminds us that even in chaos our choices define who we are. The German POWs who returned home carried more than memories of defeat. They carried proof that mercy could survive even the darkest age. Many became advocates for democracy and friendship, reshaping post-war Europe through the quiet conviction that humanity had not perished after all. In every era, the challenge remains the same: to treat others not as they deserve, but as we hope humanity will become. History remembers wars for their battles, but it redeems them through the moments when men on both sides of the wire choose compassion instead of cruelty.